I have a granddaughter I have never held. Her name is Amara. She is 14 months old. She has her father's nose and her mother's eyes, and a laugh. I have seen it on video once by accident, in a way I'm going to tell you about. A laugh that does the thing that babies' laughs do, that specific involuntary thing where you hear it and something in your chest responds before your mind has a chance to decide how it feels. I heard my granddaughter laugh. I have never been in the same room as her. I want you to sit with that for a moment before I tell you anything else. Before I tell you who I am or who her father is, or the specific long sequence of choices and silences and closed doors that produced this particular or impossible situation. A grandmother who knows her granddaughter's name and her laugh and the shape of her nose, and who has never once held her, who was not in the room when she was born, who did not know she existed until she was already 9 months old. 9 months. She had been alive for 9 months before I knew. Not because I was absent, not because I was difficult or dangerous or any of the things that would make a son's decision to keep his mother away from his child something other than what it is. Not because there was a falling out so catastrophic that the wreckage explains the distance, because Derek chose not to tell me. That is the whole of it. My son looked at the fact of his daughter's existence. The specific, enormous, irreversible fact of a human life that he had helped make. A life that carries my blood and my mother's blood and the blood of every woman in my family going back further than any of us can name. And he chose not to tell me. For 9 months. And before that. Before Amara, before the pregnancy, before the woman who became her mother stood beside my son in a ceremony I was not invited to, and became his wife. Before all of that, there were 3 years of smaller choices, the calls getting shorter, the visits getting fewer, the careful managed distance of a son who is not cutting you off dramatically, not with a confrontation or an accusation or any of the clean, comprehensible machinery of a relationship ending, just pulling back, degree by degree, until the degree of absence crossed a threshold and became something I did not have a word for. Not estrangement. Estrangement implies a rupture, a thing that broke. This was not a break. This was a door closing so slowly that by the time I understood it was closed, I was already on the other side of it. My name is Miriam. I raised Derek alone for 32 years. And I am going to tell you everything. The parts that make him the villain of the story and the parts that make me ask, in the specific sleepless honesty of 3 a.m, whether there is something I am missing. Whether there is a version of this story where the door didn't close on me, but where I pushed it, slowly, without knowing I was pushing. I have been asking that question for 3 years. I have not arrived at a clean answer, but I have arrived at this. Whatever I did or did not do. Whatever my role is in the architecture of this distance, a grandmother who has never held her granddaughter is a wound that does not have a justification. Not one I have been given, not one I can find. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you are watching from. City, state, what time it is there. I want to know who is in this room with me. And before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If your child built a life and left you completely out of it, not in anger, not after a fight, just quietly and deliberately and without explanation, what would you do? Would you keep knocking on that door? Or would you finally let yourself stop? Leave your answer below, because I am still deciding. Let me tell you who I was before my son decided I did not need to know about his life. Because I think it matters. Not because I am trying to establish myself as a perfect mother, which I was not, or as a woman who deserves sympathy simply by virtue of having suffered, which is not the same thing as deserving it. I think it matters because the distance between who I was to Derek for 32 years and who I am to him now is the most incomprehensible thing I have ever tried to understand. And you cannot understand a distance without knowing where both ends of it stand. I am Miriam Joyce Caldwell, 64 years old, Memphis, Tennessee. Retired nurse. 28 years at Methodist Le Bonheur. Most of them in the cardiac unit, which is the kind of work that does something specific to a person's relationship with time and urgency and the question of what actually matters when everything is stripped down to the essential. You spend enough years in a cardiac unit and you stop being able to pretend. About your health, about your relationships, about the things you have been deferring. The work makes you honest in a way that is sometimes uncomfortable and that I have never been able to turn off, even when turning it off would have been easier. I grew up in Memphis, the youngest of 4 children, which meant I was raised in the specific, instructive chaos of a household that had too many people and not enough of most things, and that produced in me a particular self-sufficiency, the ability to manage, to stretch, to make what you have cover what you need without complaint and without waiting for someone else to notice the gap. My mother worked. My father worked. We were not poor in the way that announces itself, but in the way that requires constant, quiet management, and I learned the management early, and I have never put it down. I married Derek's father when I was 24. His name was Robert Caldwell, and he was... I want to be accurate here because Robert is not the villain of this story, and I am not going to make him one for convenience. He was a man who was better at the idea of a life than at the living of it. Charming, attentive, full of the specific forward-leaning energy of a person who is always about to do the thing that is going to change everything. We were married for 6 years. The first 2 were good. The middle 2 were the slow, grinding process of understanding that the man I had married and the man I lived with were not the same person. The last 2 were the specific, exhausting work of 2 people staying in something that is not working because leaving requires a decision and decisions require energy and the energy was going to keeping everything else running. Derek was born in the 4th year. Robert left in the 6th. Not dramatically. I want to be precise about that because the leaving matters to the story and the way it happened matters more. He did not leave in anger. He did not leave for another woman, or not primarily. He left the way people leave when they have finally admitted to themselves that the life they are in is not the life they wanted, and when the admission has become too loud to ignore. He sat across from me at the kitchen table one evening when Derek was not yet 2 years old, and he said, "Miriam, I think we both know this isn't working." I looked at him. I said, "I know it isn't working, Robert. I have known for 2 years." He said, "So what do we do?" I said, "I think you tell me what you actually want." He told me. He wanted out, not out of Derek. I want to be clear about that because Robert was not an absent father in the total sense. He paid child support consistently, which I've always given him credit for because consistency in that particular area is not as common as it should be. He took Derek every other weekend and on holidays, and he showed up to the school events and the graduations and the significant occasions with the specific, slightly effortful presence of a man who is doing the right thing because it is right, rather than because it comes naturally. He was a decent father. He was not a present one. And the distinction between decent and present is one that Derek felt in the specific accumulating way that children feel the things that are not said more than the things that are. Every other weekend, holidays, significant occasions, the arithmetic of a childhood that had a father in it and that still, when you added it up, came out to mostly just the 2 of us. Mostly just me. I want to tell you what raising Derek alone actually looked like, because I think the telling matters, and because the version of single motherhood that people imagine and the version that is lived are 2 different things, and the gap between them is where most of the real story lives. It looked like the second job. 3 years of it. Derek was 4 to 7, the years when childcare costs what it costs, and a nurse's salary covers what it covers, and the gap between those 2 numbers has to be closed somehow. I worked weekend shifts at a clinic on top of my weekday shifts at Methodist. I was tired in the specific structural way of a person who has not slept fully in 3 years and who has organized her entire life around the management of that tiredness so that the person in her care does not feel it. Derek did not feel it. That was the point. It looked like the coat I wore for 8 years. A green wool coat I bought in 1993 that was good quality and that I wore until the lining was gone and the elbows were thin, and that I kept wearing because the money that would have replaced it went to Derek's shoes and Derek's school trips and the specific ongoing expense of a child who is growing and needs things and whose needs come before yours without discussion or resentment, because that is what you signed up for when you decided to keep him. I kept him. I want to say that plainly because it is relevant. In the months after Robert said what he said at the kitchen table, I had a decision to make, and I made it with the specific clear-eyed honesty of a woman who had spent 2 years in a cardiac unit learning not to pretend. I was 28 years old. I had a not quite 2-year-old and a salary that covered most things, and a mother who lived 40 minutes away and could help on certain days. I had options. I chose Derek. Every day for 32 years, I chose Derek. And Derek, I want to tell you who Derek was, because the person I am describing, the man who chose not to tell his mother about his wedding or his child, was not always that person, and understanding who he was before is the only way to understand what the loss of it actually means. Derek was a good boy, not in the soft, undifferentiated way of a mother who cannot see her child clearly, in the specific, observable way of a child who had been given, by circumstance, a maturity beyond his years and who wore it with a grace that I watched and marvelled at and felt responsible for in equal measure. He understood, from an early age, that our household ran on effort and that the effort was mostly mine, and he contributed to it in the small, consistent ways that a child can contribute. Setting the table without being asked, getting himself ready for school so I could sleep 20 minutes longer, the specific quiet competence of a boy who understood that his mother was tired and who had decided, somewhere in the logic of his 7-year-old heart, to make it easier where he could. He made it easier. He was funny, not performing funny. Genuinely funny, with the specific dry observational humour of a person who watches the world carefully and finds it absurd in ways that he can articulate with precision. He made me laugh at the kitchen table more times than I can count across the years of his growing up, and I have always believed that the ability to make a tired woman laugh at the end of a long day is one of the most sustaining gifts one person can give another. He was generous. He was kind to my mother, his grandmother Eleanor, who lived long enough to see him graduate college and who loved him with the specific, uncomplicated love of a grandmother who has been present enough to earn it. He was the child who remembered birthdays and who called when he said he would, and who showed up, in the years before the distance started, with the reliable, present quality of a person whose word was a thing you could build on. He was my son. The distance started, and I want to be precise about when, because the when matters. The distance started the year he met Kayla. Not immediately. I want to be fair about that too, because fairness requires it. In the beginning, Kayla was simply a woman Derek was seeing, mentioned briefly in phone calls the way new relationships are mentioned when they are still in the early private stage before they become something worth announcing. I did not push. I had learned, across 32 years of being Derek's mother and 32 years of watching other mothers make the mistake of pushing, that the fastest way to close a door with your adult child is to lean on it before it is open. I did not lean. I waited. He brought her to Memphis once, 8 months in. Sunday dinner. My house. I made the food Derek had grown up eating. The specific. A particular menu of a mother who knows her son's preferences and who had been making them since he was old enough to have preferences. I was warm. I was present. I believe, everything a mother is supposed to be when her son brings home a woman he is serious about. Kayla was quiet. Not shy quiet. I know the difference. I spent 28 years reading patients and families in high-stress situations, and I can tell the difference between a person who is reserved by nature and a person who has decided, before they arrived, how much of themselves they are going to give to this room. Kayla had decided. She gave the room very little. Derek filled the space between us with the specific, slightly effortful energy of a man who is aware of attention he cannot name, and who is compensating for it with volume and warmth, and the hope that if he talks enough, the tension will resolve itself. It did not resolve itself. They left after 3 hours. Derek called me the next day. He said, "Mama, what did you think?" I said, "I think she's still getting comfortable. Give it time." He said, "Yeah, she just needs time." We were both telling ourselves the same thing. We were both wrong about what the time was going to produce. That was the last time I saw Kayla before the Facebook photo. I want to tell you about the calls, because the calls are where it lived. The distance, the growing thing, the door closing by degrees, not in dramatic confrontations or in the silences after arguments, in the calls. In the specific, immeasurable way that a phone call between a mother and her son can change over 3 years without either of them naming what is changing, in the length of them and the texture of them and the quality of attention on the other end of the line. Derek had always been a good caller. I want to establish that because it matters to the shape of what happened. He was not a son who called out of obligation, who rang on birthdays and Mother's Day and felt that the calendar had been satisfied. He called because we had things to say to each other, because we had, across 32 years of it being mostly just the two of us, built the kind of conversational intimacy that most mothers and sons have to work for and that we had arrived at naturally through proximity and necessity and the specific, at accumulated trust of people who have been each other's primary company through the hard parts. He called on Sundays. Every Sunday, the way Eleanor had called every Sunday before she passed, the way the Sunday call had become in our family, the specific, reliable ritual of people who want to stay connected across distance, and who have chosen this as the mechanism. Derek moved to Atlanta at 26, a job opportunity, a good one, and I had encouraged it, because encouraging your child toward his own life is what you do even when the encouraging costs you something. He moved to Atlanta and the Sunday calls became the thread between us. For 6 years that thread held. Then Kayla. I want to be precise about the timeline because I think precision is the only honest way to tell this part of the story. The Sunday dinner was in March. By June the calls were shorter, not dramatically shorter, not in a way I could have pointed to and said something is wrong, 10 minutes instead of 30. The specific, slightly compressed quality of a conversation that has been given less time than it used to be given. I told myself he was busy. The new relationship takes time and attention, and the time and attention have to come from somewhere. I told myself that through June and July and August. By September, the calls were every other Sunday. I noticed. I did not say anything because I had told myself I would not lean on the door, and saying something felt like leaning. It felt like the specific counterproductive move of a mother who cannot let her adult son breathe, and who monitors the frequency of contact and registers deviations with an anxiety that pushes the very thing it fears further away. I had watched other mothers do it. I had watched the dynamic it produced. I was not going to be that mother. So I did not say anything. I waited. October came and he missed a Sunday entirely. He called on the Monday, the next day, which meant he had noticed the missing Sunday and had felt enough about it to close the gap by 1 day. I took that as a sign of something. I am not sure now what I was reading into it, but I took it as a sign that the thread was still there, that the missing Sunday was an anomaly rather than a pattern, that Derek was still oriented toward me, even if the orientation was expressing itself differently than it used to. He called on Monday. We talked for 8 minutes. He said, "Sorry I missed yesterday, it was a busy weekend." I said, "Don't worry about it. How are you?" He said, "Good, really good actually." I said, "Tell me." And he said, "I will. I just have to jump into something. Can I call you later this week?" He did not call later that week. I want to tell you what it is like to be on the receiving end of that. Of the call that doesn't come. Of the later this week that passes without contact, when the person you are waiting to hear from is your child, not the anxiety of it, which is present, but which is not the whole of it. The specific quality of the waiting itself. The way you go about your days, the errands, the coffee, the television in the evenings, the ordinary administration of a life, with a particular low-frequency awareness running underneath everything. The awareness of the unanswered thing, the conversation that was supposed to happen and didn't. I waited a week. Then I called him. He answered on the third ring. We talked for 11 minutes, and the 11 minutes had the specific, slightly careful quality of a conversation in which one person is present and the other is partially somewhere else. Answering questions, asking a few, but with the texture of a person who has allocated a portion of his attention to this call and the rest to something he is not naming. I said, "Derek, is everything okay?" He said, "Yeah, Mama, everything's fine, just busy." I said, "Okay." I said okay because what else do you say? You cannot demand presence from an adult child. You cannot schedule intimacy or invoice the deficit or present the evidence of 11-minute calls and every other Sunday and later this week that didn't happen and ask for an accounting. You say okay, you hang up, you sit with it. The visits. Derek had been coming to Memphis twice a year, Thanksgiving and one summer visit, usually in July, the specific, reliable rhythm of a son who lives in another city and who has organized his calendar around maintaining the connection. For 6 years, that rhythm held. He came for Thanksgiving and he came in July and the visits were good. Not performed good. Actually good. The easy, familiar good of two people who know each other well enough to not need an agenda. The November after the Sunday dinner, Kayla came with him. I want to tell you about that visit because I think it is the most important 3 days of this entire story, and because what happened in those 3 days, or more precisely what did not happen, is the thing I have turned over most in the years since. Kayla was polite. I want to be precise about that word. Polite. Not warm, not open, not the gradually relaxing quality of a person who was reserved at first and who has, over the 8 months since the Sunday dinner, found enough comfort to open slightly. Polite. The specific, maintained, surface-level courtesy of a person who has decided on the distance she is going to keep, and who keeps it with the consistent, unrelenting quality of someone who has made a decision rather than someone who is still finding their way. She answered questions. She did not ask any. She sat at my table for 3 days and ate my food and slept in my guest room and interacted with me with the careful, minimal efficiency of someone completing a requirement. Derek watched. I watched Derek watch. He saw what I saw. I know he did because I know my son's face, and I know what it looks like when he is aware of attention and is managing his awareness of it rather than addressing it. He was managing. For 3 days he managed, filling silences, redirecting conversations, being warm enough for both of them in the specific, exhausting way of a person who is working very hard to make something feel normal that is not normal. On the last evening, I was in the kitchen after dinner, and Derek came in alone. He stood at the counter the way he had stood at that counter since he was tall enough to reach it. I said, "Derek." He said, "Mama." I said, "Is there something you want to say to me?" He looked at the counter. He said, "I just want you two to get along." I said, "I have been nothing but kind to that woman since the first time I met her." He said, "I know." I said, "So, what is it, Derek? What have I done?" He said, "You haven't done anything. She just needs time. She needs time." The same words from 8 months earlier, the same words I had told myself in the same order and that were beginning. 3 days into a visit in which Kayla had asked me exactly 0 questions about my life, or my work, or my history, or anything that would indicate a genuine interest in knowing who her boyfriend's mother was. The same words were beginning to feel like a door being held against me rather than a promise about what was on the other side. I said, "Okay, Derek." And he hugged me before they left the next morning. A good hug. The specific full hug of a son who loves his mother and who is in the middle of something he cannot yet articulate, and who is expressing in the hug what he is not yet able to say in words. I held on a beat longer than usual. He let me. They drove back to Atlanta. The calls did not improve after Thanksgiving. The July visit did not happen. Derek called in June to say that he and Kayla had plans that summer. A trip, he said. Something they had been planning. He said they would come at Christmas instead. I said, of course. I said, have a wonderful trip. Christmas did not happen either. He called on Christmas Eve, not Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, which is not a day we had ever treated as the significant one, and which felt, receiving the call on that day rather than the next, unlike a message about prioritization that he was not saying directly. He said Kayla's family was in town. He said they would come in the new year. The new year came. He did not come. I am going to tell you something now that I have not told anyone. In February of that year, 14 months after the Sunday dinner, 7 months before the Facebook photo, I drove to Atlanta. I did not tell Derek I was coming. I want to be honest about that because I think honesty requires me to say that this was not my finest decision, that the woman who had told herself for 14 months that she was not going to lean on the door had, in a specific low moment on a February Saturday, gotten in her car and driven 4 hours because the silence had become a thing she could not sit with for one more weekend. I drove to Atlanta. Then I parked outside his building. I sat in my car for 45 minutes. And then I drove home. I did not go in. I did not call him from the parking lot. I did not ring his buzzer. I did not do any of the things that the 45 minutes in the parking lot had been the preparation for, because somewhere in those 45 minutes I understood that whatever was behind that door was not going to be improved by me arriving at it unannounced, and that the only thing I would accomplish was confirming, for Derek and for Kayla and for myself, that I was exactly the kind of mother they had apparently decided I was. I drove home. I did not tell him. I have never told him. I am telling you. And 3 months after that February Saturday, I was in my bed on a Sunday morning with cold coffee on the nightstand, and I opened Facebook, and Sandra Okafor had been at a wedding, and my son was in the background in a suit I had never seen, and the woman in white beside him was his wife. His wife. 6 months ago today. I did not call him that Sunday. I want to tell you why, because I think the why matters, and because the easy explanation, that I was too shocked, too hurt, too blindsided by the specific enormity of what the photo meant, is true, but not complete. I did not call him that Sunday because I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after I put it face down on the nightstand and picked it back up and looked at the photo again, and I thought about every version of that phone call and what it would produce. I thought about calling in the raw, immediate aftermath of the discovery. While the coffee was still cold, while the photo was still open on my screen, while the specific physical quality of the shock was still present in my chest. I thought about what I would say and what he would say and what the call would become, and I understood, with the clarity of a woman who has spent 28 years in a cardiac unit, learning to make decisions under pressure, that the call I made in that moment would not be the call I wanted to have made. I put the phone down. I got up. I made fresh coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Derek had stood at the counter on Thanksgiving evening and said she just needs time. And I drank the coffee and I thought, not about what to say, about what I wanted. Because those are two different questions, and conflating them is the mistake I had been making for 18 months. I had been asking myself what to say, how to reach Derek, how to close the distance, how to find the words that would open the door that had been closing by degrees since the Sunday dinner with Kayla. I had been treating it as a communication problem, a language problem, as though the right sentence, delivered in the right tone, at the right moment, would produce the thing I was reaching for. Sitting at that table on that January Sunday, I understood for the first time that it was not a communication problem. Derek knew how to reach me. He had my number. He had my address. He had 38 years of knowing exactly where I was and how to find me. The silence between us was not the silence of a man who had lost the words. It was the silence of a man who had made a choice about what to say and to whom and when. He had chosen. The question was not what to say to him. The question was what I was going to do with the fact of his choosing. I called him on a Tuesday, 2 days after the photo. 2 days of sitting with it, turning it over, letting the initial shock settle into something more manageable that I could carry into a conversation without it spilling over in ways I could not control. He answered on the second ring. His voice was normal. That is the detail that has stayed with me most across the years since. The normalcy of his voice. Not guilty, not braced. Not the voice of a man who is expecting a call that he knows is coming and that he has been dreading. Just Derek's voice. Easy, slightly distracted. The voice of a man answering a call from his mother on a Tuesday afternoon. I said, "Derek." He said, "Hey mama, what's up? What's up?" I said, "I saw a photo on Facebook this weekend." A pause. Not a long pause. A breath's worth. The specific calibrated pause of a person who has just understood which photo and who is deciding in real time how to respond. He said, "Yeah." One word. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I can explain." Not, "Mama, I have been meaning to call you. I know this is not how you should have found out. I know what this looks like, and I want you to hear it from me." Yeah, I sat with that word for a moment. I said, "You got married?" He said, "Yeah." Last July. Last July. 6 months before the photo. 19 months after the Sunday dinner. 19 months in which Derek had known, had been planning, now had stood beside a woman and made promises in front of people and built a life. And had not told me. I said, "Derek, why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet. Not the calibrated pause of before. A different quality of quiet. The specific, slightly heavy silence of a person who has a reason and who is deciding whether the reason is one he wants to say out loud. He said, "It was a small wedding. Just close family and friends." I sat with that. Close family. I said, "I am your family, Derek." He said, "I know, Mama." I said, "I am the person who raised you. I am the only family you had for a very long time, and I am telling you that I am your family, and you are telling me you know, and I need you to help me understand how those two things produced a wedding I was not invited to." He said, "Mama, it's complicated. It's complicated." I had heard those two words across the 18 months of the growing distance in various forms and combinations. She needs time, I've been busy, will come at Christmas. And they had all been, I understood now, versions of the same two words. It's complicated. A container for something he was not willing to take out and examine in the light where I could see it. I said, "Derek, I need more than that." He said, "I know. Can we talk about this later? I'm in the middle of something. I want to tell you what happened inside me when he said that." Not the anger. The anger was present, but it was not the loudest thing. The loudest thing was the specific, sickening recognition of a pattern. "Later this week. We'll come at Christmas. Can we talk about this later?" The same deferral. The same gentle and consistent redirection away from the thing I was asking for, applied now to a question so large that the deferral of it was its own kind of answer. I said, "Okay, Derek." I said it the way I had been saying okay for 18 months. He called back 3 days later. The call lasted 22 minutes and produced at its end less than I had at its beginning. Not because Derek was cruel. He was not cruel. He has never been cruel to me, and I think the absence of cruelty is one of the things that makes this particular wound so difficult to close because there is nothing clean to push against. He was careful. He was the specific, managed careful of a man who has thought about this conversation and has decided what he is willing to say and has drawn a line at everything else. He said the wedding had been small. He said he had not wanted a big production. He said he knew I would have wanted to be there and that he was sorry I had found out the way I did. He did not say why I had not been invited. I asked directly. He said, "Mama, Kayla and I just wanted to do it our way. Their way." I said, Derek, what did I do? A silence. I said, I am asking you honestly, not to fight, not to make you feel guilty. I am asking because I have spent 18 months trying to understand what I did that produced this distance, and I cannot find it, and I need you to tell me if you can see it because I cannot. He said, You didn't do anything, Mama. I said, Then help me understand. He said, It's just, Kayla and I are building our life and we needed to do that on our own terms. On their own terms. I sat with that phrase for a long time after he said it. I am still sitting with it. I have turned it over from every direction I can find, and I have not been able to locate inside it a meaning that explains the specific degree of exclusion that their own terms had required. Their own terms had required a wedding I was not told about. Their own terms had required 18 months of diminishing contact. Their own terms had required, as I would discover 14 months later, something considerably larger than a wedding. But I did not know that yet. I said okay. I said I loved him. He said he loved me. We hung up. And the calls continued, not the Sunday calls of before, not the 30-minute thread of two people who have things to say to each other. Monthly mostly, sometimes 6 weeks between them. Short, careful. Surface-level exchanges that covered the weather and the health and the general state of things without going anywhere near the room where the real things lived. I accepted it. I want to be honest about that. I accepted it because the alternative was to not accept it, and the alternative felt like losing him entirely, and losing him entirely was not something I was prepared to choose. So I took the monthly calls, and I took the surface level, and I told myself that this was a season, that seasons change, that the door was not permanently closed, but temporarily, and painfully, and inexplicably ajar. I told myself that for 14 more months, until a woman named Patricia Green told me about Amara. Patricia Green was a nurse I had worked with for 12 years at Methodist. We were not close in the way of people who see each other outside of work, but we were close in the way of people who have stood beside each other in difficult rooms for a long time, and who carry a specific, professional intimacy because of it. She had retired 2 years before me. We saw each other occasionally at church and at the occasional gathering of former colleagues, and we had the easy, warm relationship of people who like each other and do not need proximity to maintain it. She called me on a Thursday evening. She said, Miriam, I saw something today, and I did not know whether to call you, and I decided I would rather call and be wrong than not call and have you find out some other way. I said, Patricia, what is it? She said, I ran into Derek today, at the Kroger on Poplar. He was with his wife and they had a baby. Oh, I was very still, she said. A little girl. Beautiful. Maybe 8, 9 months old. He introduced me to his wife, Kayla, very pretty, and I said, Is this your first? And he said yes. Her name is Amara. She was born in March. March. Patricia said, Miriam, I assumed you knew. I was chatting away about how beautiful she was, and something in his face made me think. And then I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to say anything in front of Kayla, and I said, Patricia. She stopped. I said, It's okay. Thank you for calling me. She said, Honey, I am so sorry. I said, It's okay. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table. March. My granddaughter had been born in March. It was November. She was 8 months old, 8 months of existing in the world, 8 months of the specific, enormous, irreversible fact of her presence in it. And the woman who had raised her father alone for 32 years, who had worn a coat for 8 years so he could have new shoes, who had driven to Atlanta on a February Saturday and sat in a parking lot for 45 minutes and driven home so as not to lean on his door. 8 months. And I had not known. I looked at my hands on the kitchen table. I thought about March. I had spoken to Derek in March. We had had one of the monthly calls, 12 minutes, the weather, the health, the general state of things. And he had been on the phone with me for 12 minutes in the month his daughter was born, and he had not said her name. He had not said her name. I did not call him that night. Same reason as the Sunday with the Facebook photo. Same kitchen table, same cold clarity of a woman who has learned across the specific, our accumulated experience of this particular kind of waiting, that the call made in the raw moment is not the call she wants to have made. I sat at the table for a long time after I hung up with Patricia, and I let the thing be as large as it was. Not managing it, not redirecting it into something more containable, just sitting with the full, undiminished weight of what I had just learned. My granddaughter had been born in March. It was November. 8 months. I want to tell you what 8 months means in the life of a baby because I think the specificity matters and because the abstract number does not fully contain what it represents. 8 months is the difference between a newborn and a person, between the specific, curled, entirely dependent creature of the first days and a child who sits up on her own, who reaches for things, who has preferences and expressions, and the beginning of the specific observable personality that will be hers for the rest of her life. 8 months is the rolling over and the first solid foods and the sitting and the early sounds that are not yet words, but that are the architecture of words, the foundation of a voice that is being built in real time. I had missed all of it, not because I had been absent, because I had not been told. I sat with that distinction for a long time. It is the distinction that matters most in this story and the one that is hardest to sit with because it removes the comfort of self-blame. Self-blame is, in a strange way, easier than what I was sitting with. If I had done something to deserve the exclusion, if there was a specific, identifiable failure on my part that had produced this distance, then the distance would have a logic, and the logic would have a solution, and the solution would be within my reach. But Derek had told me I had not done anything, and I believed him. I called Derek on a Saturday morning, 10 days after Patricia's call. 10 days of sitting with it, of going about the ordinary administration of my life with the specific low-frequency weight of what I knew running underneath everything. 10 days of deciding what I wanted from the call. He answered on the 4th ring. I said, "Derek." He said, "Hey, Mama." I said, "I need to talk to you about something." A pause. He said, "Okay." I said, "I heard you have a daughter." The silence that followed was the longest silence of the entire 3 years. Not the calibrated pause of the Facebook photo call. Not the slightly heavy quiet of a man deciding how much of the truth to give. This was something different, the specific suspended quality of a silence that follows the removal of the last thing between two people and the arrival of the thing itself, unmediated, in the space between them. He said, "Who told you?" Not, "Yes." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "Mama, I have been trying to figure out how to tell you. Who told you?" I said, "It doesn't matter who told me. What matters is that she exists, and she has been existing for 8 months, and I did not know." He said, "I was going to tell you." I said, "Derek, when?" He said, "When the time was right. When the time was right." I want to tell you what happened inside me when he said that, because I think the honest telling of this moment requires me to describe it accurately. I did not shout. I did not cry. I felt something that I can only describe as the specific, clarifying cold of a woman who has arrived at the end of something, and who knows it, and who is deciding, in real time, how to conduct herself at the end of it. I said, "Derek, she is 8 months old. She will be walking soon. She is going to be a person before I have ever been in the same room as her, and you were waiting for the right time." He said, "Mama, I know how this looks." I said, "I don't think you do. I don't think you have any idea how this looks from where I am standing, because if you did, you would not be telling me you were waiting for the right time." He was quiet. I said, "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to tell me honestly." He said, "Okay." I said, "Is this Kayla? Is this her decision? And you are going along with it? Or is this you? Derek? Because I need to know which one I am dealing with. A long pause. He said, "It's not that simple, Mama." I said, "It is exactly that simple. I am asking you a yes or no question about your own choices. Is this you or is this her?" He said, "We make decisions together." I said, "That's not an answer." He said, "Mama." I said, "Derek, I need an answer." He said, "Kayla and I have talked about this, about boundaries, about what we want our family to look like, and I have supported what she needs." What she needs? I sat with that phrase. I said, "What does she need, Derek?" He said, "She had a difficult relationship with her own mother. She has a lot of feelings about family and space and—" I said, "Derek, I am not Kayla's mother. I am yours." He said, "I know that." Oh, I said, "Then help me understand how what Kayla needs from her own family situation becomes the reason your mother does not know her granddaughter exists." He did not answer immediately. When he did, it was with the specific, slightly deflated quality of a man who has run out of the careful, managed language he had prepared for this conversation and who is now speaking from somewhere less rehearsed. He said, "Mama, Kayla gets anxious. About family stuff, about people having expectations, about feeling like she has to perform for people, and when she gets anxious, it affects everything, and I just—" He stopped. I said, "You just what?" He said, "I made choices that I thought would make things easier." I said, "Easier for who?" He did not answer. I said, "I am going to ask you one more question and I need you to hear it as the honest question it is and not as an accusation. Can you do that?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Do you want me in your life, Derek?" The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. It was the silence of a man who loves his mother and who has constructed around that love a life that does not have room for her in it, and who is sitting with the specific, terrible discomfort of those two things being true at the same time. He said, "Of course I do, Mama." I said, "Then I need you to understand something. I have been patient for 3 years. I have not leaned on the door. I have not shown up uninvited. I have not made demands or issued ultimatums or done any of the things that would justify this level of exclusion. I have loved you from a distance that you set, and I have respected that distance, even when respecting it cost me things I cannot get back." I paused. I said, "I cannot get back the first 8 months of my granddaughter's life. That is gone. Whatever the right time was supposed to be, it has already taken 8 months from me and from her, and neither of us will ever have them." He said, "I know, Mama. I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are. And I believed that too. The same way I had believed you didn't do anything. Not as a deflection, but as the truth of a man who is genuinely sorry and who is also genuinely not prepared to change the conditions that produce the thing he is sorry for." I said, "Derek, I love you. I have loved you since before you knew what love was, and I will love you when this conversation is over, and I will love you through whatever comes next." That is not in question. I paused. I said, "But I need you to know that I am not going to keep knocking on a door that you have made clear you are not going to open. Not because I have given up. Because I have some dignity left, and I intend to keep it." He said, "Mama, I don't want you to stop." I said, "I know you don't. You want me available and patient and at the end of a phone that you call when it suits you, and a door you can open when you decide the time is right. And I understand that. I understand it because I raised you, and I know who you are, and I know that what you want is not malicious. It is just insufficient. It is not enough. And I am telling you clearly, for the first time, that it is not enough." He was very quiet. I said, "I would like to meet my granddaughter, Derek. I would like to be in her life. I am not asking for more than what a grandmother is. Present, loving, not a performance requirement or a source of anxiety. Just present." He said, "I hear you, Mama." I said, "Okay." I said, I love you. He said, I love you too, Mama. We hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and then I did something I had not done since the February Saturday when I drove to Atlanta and sat in his parking lot for 45 minutes. I cried. Not the suppressed, managed tears of a woman maintaining composure for a phone call, the other kind. The specific, necessary, a long-deferred kind that arrives when you have finally said the true thing out loud and the saying of it has opened something that the not saying had been holding closed. I cried for a while, and then I stopped, and I made coffee, and I sat at the table with it while it was still hot, and I thought about Amara, about a little girl in Atlanta who had her father's nose and her mother's eyes, and a laugh I had heard once by accident, and who did not know that somewhere in Memphis there was a woman who already loved her, who had always been going to love her, who was not done trying to find a way into the room where she was. Derek called back 2 weeks later, not a Sunday, a Wednesday evening, which was not a day we had ever established as significant, and which therefore carried, receiving the call on that day, did the specific quality of an unscheduled thing, not the routine, not the obligation, not the monthly maintenance call that covered the weather and the health and the surface of things. A Wednesday evening call that he had made because he had decided to make it rather than because the calendar required it. I answered on the first ring. I want to tell you what the call was and what it was not because I think accuracy matters here more than anywhere else in this story. It was not the call where Derek explained everything. It was not the call where the door opened fully and the light came through and the 3 years of distance collapsed into something I could finally understand and forgive and move past. It was not that call. I do not know if that call is coming. What it was different from every call we had had in 3 years. He said, Mama, I've been thinking about what you said. I said, okay. He said, I've been thinking about it a lot, actually. About what you said about the door, about dignity. I said, and? He said, and I think you were right. I sat with that. Not with triumph. I want to be precise about that because triumph was not what I felt. I felt the specific, careful relief of a person who has said a true thing and been heard, and who is not yet sure what the hearing is going to produce but who recognizes it as different from not being heard. He said, I want you to meet Amara. 4 words. I want you to meet Amara. And I want to tell you what those 4 words did to me because I think the doing of them is part of the story, and because the woman sitting at her kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in November is not a woman who takes those 4 words lightly. I had been waiting for a version of those words for 8 months without knowing I was waiting. I had been carrying the weight of their absence since the Thursday evening when Patricia Green had called and said, honey, I am so sorry, and I had said it's okay and hung up and sat with my hands on the table. I said, I would like that very much. He said, I want to talk to Kayla first. I want to do this in a way that works for everyone, in a way that works for everyone. I noted the phrase. And I noted that the everyone in it included Kayla and included Amara and included Derek, and that I was the variable, the one whose inclusion was being negotiated, whose presence in my own granddaughter's life was a matter requiring management and communication and the careful navigation of another woman's anxiety about family and expectations and the performance of things. I said, okay, Derek, take the time you need. He said, it won't be long. I said, okay. I want to tell you about the 3 weeks between that call and the Saturday in December when I drove to Atlanta. They were the longest 3 weeks of the 3 years. Not because I was uncertain. I had said what I had to say and Derek had heard it, and the thing was in motion and I had done my part, and the rest was not mine to manage. Long because the waiting, which I had been practicing for 3 years in various forms, and which I had become, out of necessity, reasonably competent at. The waiting now had a specific object. Before it had been abstract. Before, I had been waiting for something whose shape I could not see. Now I was waiting for Amara, for a specific little girl in a specific apartment in Atlanta who had a name and a laugh and her father's nose, and who did not yet know that the waiting was mutual. She was waiting for me too. She just did not know it yet. Derek called on a Thursday. He said, "Can you come Saturday?" I said, "Yes." I did not ask any of the questions I had. I did not ask whether Kayla was ready, whether Kayla was willing, whether Kayla had been persuaded or had arrived at willingness on her own terms, or was simply tolerating the visit with the specific, unmaintained politeness I had experienced at the Thanksgiving table 4 years earlier. I did not ask because the answers to those questions were not going to change my answer to his question, and because some information is more useful not known until you are in the room with it. I said yes. I drove to Atlanta on a Saturday morning in December. Same roads as the February Saturday 2 years earlier. Same 4 hours. Different quality of the driving. Not the low, hollow desperation of a woman going somewhere she had not been invited and would not go in, but the specific forward-leaning energy of a woman who has been invited and who is going. I had bought a gift for Amara. A soft stuffed rabbit, cream-coloured, with the specific tactile quality of the kind of toy that is made to be held by small hands and that holds up to the specific, vigorous attention that small hands give things they love. I had stood in the store for 20 minutes with it in my hands before I put it in my cart. Not because I was uncertain about the gift, because I was standing in a store in Memphis buying a gift for a granddaughter I had never met, and the specific, enormous weight of that ordinary act required 20 minutes to fully inhabit before I could move through it. I put the rabbit in my cart. I drove to Atlanta on a Saturday morning. Derek met me at the door. He looked the way Derek always looks, the specific familiar arrangement of a face I have known for 38 years, the face that was a 6-pound baby in a Memphis hospital, and a 7-year-old at a kitchen counter, and an 18-year-old leaving for college and every age between and since. He looked like my son. He also looked, I noticed, like a man who had navigated something difficult in the days between the Thursday call and this Saturday morning, and who was carrying the navigation in the set of his shoulders. He hugged me. A real hug. The full hug from the Thanksgiving 4 years ago, the hug that said what the words were not yet fully saying. I held on. He let me. Kayla was in the living room. I want to tell you about Kayla because I think she deserves an accurate telling, and because the accurate telling is more complicated than the version where she is simply the woman who kept me from my son and my granddaughter. She was standing when I came in, not sitting, standing, which told me she had been aware of the sound of the door and had made a decision about how to receive me, and had chosen standing over sitting as her posture for this moment. She was smaller than I remembered, prettier, in the specific, slightly tired way of a woman who has a 9-month-old and who has not been sleeping fully and who is beautiful anyway. She said, "Hi, Miriam." I said, "Hi, Kayla." We looked at each other. I want to tell you what I saw when I looked at her because I think the seeing matters, and because what I saw was not what I expected to see after 3 years of being on the receiving end of the choices she and Derek had made together. I saw someone who was frightened. Not of me specifically, or not only of me, of the situation, of the specific, loaded quality of this particular Saturday morning, and what it meant, and what it required, and what might be asked of her that she was not sure she could give. I know what frightened looks like. I spent 28 years in rooms with frightened people, and I know the specific physical vocabulary of it. The careful stillness, the slightly over-controlled quality of movement, the eyes that are doing more work than eyes should have to do. Kayla was frightened, and underneath the frightened. And I say this as a woman who had spent 3 years on the wrong end of this woman's anxiety and who had every reason to feel nothing generous toward her. Underneath the frightened, there was something that looked like a person trying, not succeeding fully, not giving me everything I might have wanted from that room, but trying. And I said, "Thank you for having me." She said, "Of course." And then Derek said, "Do you want to meet her?" I said yes. Amara was in a bouncy seat in the corner of the living room, 9 months old. her father's nose, her mother's eyes. And when Derek picked her up and turned her toward me and said, "Amara, this is your grandma," she looked at me with the specific, serious, entirely unself-conscious attention of a 9-month-old who is encountering a new face and who has not yet learned to perform her reactions for an audience. She looked at me. I looked at her. And then she smiled. Not a performed smile. Not the social smile of a child who has been coached on how to respond to new people. The real one. The sudden full-face eruption of it. The specific involuntary joy of a baby who has decided, for reasons entirely her own, that the new face is a good one. She smiled at me. I held it together for approximately 4 seconds, and then I did not hold it together. Derek put her in my arms. I sat down on the couch because my legs required it, and I held my granddaughter for the first time, and she grabbed my finger with the specific, total grip of a baby who does not yet know the difference between holding on and holding on for dear life. And I looked at her face, her father's nose, her mother's eyes, 9 months of existing in the world without me. And I thought about the coat I wore for 8 years. I thought about the Sunday calls. I thought about the February parking lot. I thought about Patricia Green saying, "Honey, I am so sorry," and me saying it's okay when it was the least okay thing that had ever happened to me. And I thought, here she is. She is here. And I am here. We are in the same room. I stayed for 4 hours. Kayla made lunch, not effortlessly, not with the warm ease of a woman who has fully arrived at comfort, but genuinely. She made lunch, and she sat at the table and she asked me, for the first time in all the years I had known her, a question about my life. About nursing. About what it was like to work in a cardiac unit. She asked it with the slightly careful quality of a person who is extending themselves past their comfort and who knows it and who is doing it anyway. I answered. I asked her something back. We were careful with each other. We were not warm yet. But we were trying. When I drove home to Memphis that evening with the cream-coloured rabbit still in my bag, Amara had fallen asleep before I could give it to her, and I had not wanted to wake her, and Derek had said, "Bring it next time." Next time. 2 words that contained more than they appeared to. I put the rabbit on my kitchen table when I got home. I looked at it for a long time. Next time. The second visit was in February. 6 weeks after the December Saturday. Derek called on a Thursday evening, a Wednesday evening the time before, now a Thursday, the unscheduled calls becoming their own kind of schedule, which is not the same as the Sunday calls, but which is something, and I have learned, across 3 years of measuring the something against the nothing, to receive something with the full attention it deserves, rather than holding it against the everything it is not. He said, "Can you come next weekend?" I said, "Yes." I drove to Atlanta on a Saturday morning in February, and this time the cream-coloured rabbit was in my bag, and this time Amara was awake when I arrived, and this time I gave it to her directly, put it in her hands, watched her examine it with the specific focused attention of a 10-month-old who takes the investigation of new objects seriously. She held it for 45 minutes. She fell asleep with it. I want to tell you about the February visit because it was different from the December one in ways that mattered, and that I have been thinking about since. Not dramatically different, not the transformation scene, not the moment where everything that had been wrong between Kayla and me resolved into warmth and ease and the specific, natural intimacy of women who have decided to love each other. It was not that. It was incrementally different. Kayla sat closer. At the December visit, she had occupied the chair across the room, the specific measured distance of a woman maintaining the perimeter she had set for herself. In February, she sat on the same couch, not beside me. One cushion between us, which is not the same as beside, but the same couch. I noticed and I did not remark on it, because remarking on it would have made it a thing, and making it a thing would have made her aware of the noticing and awareness in Kayla. I was beginning to understand, produced the opposite of what I wanted. I let it be unremarked. She asked me 2 questions at lunch. Not 1. 2. About my mother. She had heard from Derek, I assume, that my mother had died 4 years ago, and she asked about her with the specific, slightly tentative quality of a person who is not sure if the question is welcome, and who is asking anyway. I told her about Eleanor, about the Sunday calls, about the card games on Friday evenings with the nickel stakes, about the woman who had understood that education was armor, and who had sent me into the world with that understanding baked in. Kayla listened. She said, "She sounds like she was incredible." I said, "She was." And then Kayla said, "I didn't have that." 3 words. I didn't have that. Not an explanation. Not an apology. Not a bridge across 3 years of closed doors and missed Sundays, and a granddaughter who had existed for 8 months before I knew her name. Just 3 words, offered quietly, with the specific, undefended quality of a person who is not asking for anything in return, and who is not sure the offering will be received. I said, "I know." I did not say more than that. Not because I did not feel more. Because the more was not mine to give in that moment. Not across one couch cushion of distance at a kitchen table in Atlanta in February, not yet. But I received the 3 words. I let them mean what they meant. And I understood, for the first time, something about Kayla that I had not understood from a distance. She was not trying to take my son from me. She was trying to protect something in herself that had been broken before Derek, and that Derek, in the specific loving, misguided way of a man who wants to fix the people he loves, had reorganized his life to accommodate. That is not an excuse. I want to be precise about that, because I think the understanding of a thing and the excusing of a thing are not the same, and I am not going to conflate them to make this story tidier than it is. What Kayla needed from her own wounds did not entitle her to take 3 years from me and 8 months of Amara's life. Understanding why she did it does not make the doing of it acceptable. Both of those things are true, and I am holding both of them at the same time in the specific exhausting way that honest people hold complicated things. But understanding why she did it makes it possible to sit on the same couch, one cushion between us, and that is where we are. Derek and I. I want to tell you about Derek because the story of where things are now is not only about Amara and not only about Kayla. It is about my son, the person I raised, the man he became, and the specific painful gap between the man I believed he was and the man the last 3 years revealed. We have talked, not the managed, surface-level monthly calls of the distance years. Actually talked, in the way we used to talk. The specific, substantive intimacy of 2 people who know each other well enough to say the real things, and who have, in the month since November, been finding their way back to that register. It has been slow. It has not been linear. There have been visits where something shifted and visits where nothing did, and phone calls that felt like progress and phone calls that felt like the careful, managed distance reasserting itself when I had thought we were past it. I have learned not to measure each individual interaction against the total trajectory, to look at the direction rather than the specific step, which is easier to say than to do, and which I am managing with varying degrees of success, depending on the week. Derek has said he is sorry, more than once, in more than one form, not always in words, sometimes in the Wednesday evening calls, sometimes in the way he held the door when I arrived for a visit, sometimes in the specific small attentiveness of a son who is trying to show something he is not yet sure how to say. I have received the apologies the way I received Kayla's 3 words, not with the demand that they cover the full amount of what was owed, but as the installments they are. The beginning of an accounting that may take longer to complete than either of us would choose. I have not told him about the parking lot, the February Saturday 2 years ago, the 4-hour drive, the 45 minutes in his parking lot, and the 4 hours home. I have not told him, and I have been thinking about whether to tell him because I think there is a version of this story where the telling of it is necessary, where Derek needs to understand the specific, quiet, sustained love of a woman who drove to his building and sat outside it and chose not to ring his buzzer because she loved him enough to protect the door she was trying not to close. I have not decided yet, Some things keep their power by remaining unsaid. Some things lose their power the same way. I am still deciding which one this is. Amara. I want to tell you about where things are with Amara because she is the center of this story and the center of what I am rebuilding, and the person whose life is the one that matters most in the specific, clear-eyed calculus of what the last 3 years have cost and what the next years can still be. I have seen her 6 times. 6 visits since the December Saturday. 6 times in her father's apartment in Atlanta, in the company of her parents, in the careful, incrementally warming atmosphere of a family that is learning how to include a grandmother it kept out for too long. 6 times of watching her change, from the 9-month-old who grabbed my finger to the 14-month-old she is now, who has pulled herself to standing and who is on the verge of walking, who says 3 words clearly and several others in the specific, confident approximation of a child who knows what she means even when the word is not quite right. She knows me. I want to say that plainly because it is the most important thing I have to report, and because it is the thing I was most afraid, in the months of not knowing her, that I would not be able to recover. The specific relational recognition of a grandmother, not the performance of it, not the polite tolerance of a familiar stranger, but the actual, felt, observable thing. She knows me. She reaches for me when I arrive. Not every time. She is 14 months old, and 14-month-olds have their own internal weather, and there are visits where she is focused on other things and I am a peripheral presence, and I have learned to receive that without reading it as rejection. But there are visits where I come through the door and she is across the room and she sees me and she moves toward me with the specific whole-body orientation of a child who has decided that the person who just arrived is a person she wants. Those visits are the ones I drive 4 hours for without hesitation. Those visits are the ones I hold against the 3 years of not knowing she existed and feel. Not reconciliation exactly, but something in the direction of it. The specific, imperfect, or ongoing process of a woman who has decided that what is still possible matters more than what is already lost. The rabbit sleeps in her crib. Derek told me that on a phone call in March, that Amara had claimed the rabbit as the specific, non-negotiable sleep companion without which the bedtime routine did not conclude satisfactorily. He told me with the easy, slightly amused quality of a father reporting a toddler's preferences, and I received it the way I receive the Wednesday calls. As something, not everything, but something real and warm and pointing in the right direction. The rabbit sleeps in her crib. I bought it in Memphis standing in a store for 20 minutes, and it sleeps in her crib in Atlanta, and she holds it the way small children hold the things they have decided are theirs. I have decided she is mine. Whatever the last 3 years cost, whatever the next years require, she is mine. I want to tell you about the thing that is still missing because I think the honest ending of this story requires it, and because I have committed to honesty throughout, and I am not going to abandon it at the end where the honesty costs the most. The thing that is still missing is the Sunday calls. Not literally. Derek calls on Wednesdays now, Thursdays sometimes, and the calls are longer than they were, and realer than they were, and I am grateful for them in the way I have learned to be grateful for what is, rather than what was. The Sunday calls are not coming back as they were. That version of Derek and Miriam, the one that existed for 6 years before the Sunday dinner with Kayla, the easy, weekly intimacy of 2 people who have been each other's primary company through the hard parts and who have found a way to maintain that across distance. That version is not the version I have now. I have a different version. One that is being built from a different starting point, with different materials, in the aftermath of damage that has not been fully repaired and may not be. One that includes Kayla, carefully, incrementally, 1 couch cushion at a time. One that includes Amara, which is the part that makes all the other parts survivable. I am not going to pretend it is the same. It is not the same. It is what it is, which is real and imperfect. and still in progress, and mine. And on balance, on the specific, honest, her clear-eyed balance of a woman who spent 28 years in a cardiac unit learning to assess situations without the comfort of pretending. On balance, it is enough to keep going. It is enough. I want to tell you what Sunday mornings look like now. I still make the coffee too early. I still lie in bed for a while before I get up, with the phone on the nightstand and the specific quiet texture of a Sunday morning that has not yet decided what it is going to be. The difference is that I am not waiting for the phone to ring anymore. Not in the held-breath, low-frequency way of the 3 years when the waiting was the whole of the morning, when the coffee went cold and Derek did not call, and the silence had the specific weighted quality of an absence that has been noticed and is being felt. I am not waiting like that anymore. Not because Derek calls on Sundays. He doesn't. He calls on Wednesdays, sometimes Thursdays. Longer calls than the monthly maintenance calls of the distance years. Realer calls. Calls that go somewhere instead of carefully staying on the surface. But not Sundays. Sunday mornings are mine now in a way they were not when I was waiting for them to be something else. And I have made a kind of peace with that. Not the peace of a woman who got what she wanted, but the peace of a woman who has stopped measuring what she has against what she used to have and has started measuring it against what it actually is. What it actually is enough. Not everything. Enough. I want to say something to Derek. Derek, I have been your mother for 38 years, and I have been your mother through the years when being your mother was the whole of what I was. When the second job, and the green coat, and the Sunday dinners, and the kitchen counter where you stood since you were tall enough to reach it were the complete, sufficient architecture of my daily life. I have been your mother through the years when you grew past needing that architecture and built your own. I have been your mother through 3 years of a door that was closing, and through the November phone call, and through 6 visits to an apartment in Atlanta where I am learning, one couch cushion at a time, to be the grandmother your daughter deserves. I am still your mother. I want you to know something that I have not said directly in any of the Wednesday calls or the Atlanta visits or the careful, incremental work of these past months. I am not angry. I was. I want to be honest. There were months in there where the anger was present and real and specific, and I am not going to pretend otherwise because pretending otherwise would be a disservice to both of us. But the anger has become something else, something quieter and more sustainable and more useful than anger. Something that looks from the inside like the specific, clear-eyed love of a woman who knows exactly who you are, the good of it and the cost of it, and the complicated, imperfect whole of it, and who has decided that the knowing is not a reason to love you less. It is a reason to love you more carefully, more honestly, without the specific structural blindness that love sometimes requires and that I am no longer willing to maintain at the cost of my own dignity. You have a daughter who reaches for me when I walk through the door. Whatever the last 3 years cost, that is what I am keeping. Come home when you can. Bring Amara. To everyone who is still here, tell me where you are watching from. City, state, what time it is there. Drop it in the comments right now. I want to know who stayed with me through all of it. I need to ask you something before you go. If your child shut the door on you, not in anger, not after a fight, just quietly and deliberately, and without a reason you could find, would you keep knocking? Or would you finally let yourself stop? I kept knocking. For 3 years I kept knocking, and I want to tell you that the keeping was not weakness, and it was not desperation, and it was not the specific, undignified persistence of a woman who does not know when she is not wanted. It was love, the specific, sustained, unglamorous, coat-wearing for 8 years kind of love that does not announce itself, and does not require an audience, and does not stop because the stopping would be easier. It was always just love. But I also want to tell you this, and I mean this for the woman who is in year 1 of the closed door, and the woman who is in year 3, and the woman who is somewhere in between and does not know how much longer she can hold on. You are allowed to put your dignity first. You are allowed to say, I have knocked long enough, and the knocking is costing me more than I have left to spend, and I am going to stop now. Not because I have given up, because I have given enough. Both things are true. Knocking is love. Stopping is also love. The difference is what you can carry. Only you know what you can carry. And one practical thing before I go. If you have a grandchild you have never met, or a child who has gone quiet in the way Derek went quiet, the slow degrees of it, the calls getting shorter and the visits getting fewer, do not wait for the right time to say the true thing. There is no right time. There is only now and the specific irreplaceable days that are passing while you wait for a moment that is more comfortable than this one. Say the true thing now. I said it in November. I wish I had said it sooner. If this story found you, if any part of it landed in the place where the real thing lives, share it. For the mother in your life who is lying in bed on a Sunday morning waiting for a phone that is not going to ring, help me find her, as she is not alone, and subscribe, because I have more stories and every one of them belongs to a woman who kept going when the keeping was hard and who found, on the other side of the hard, something worth finding. I am Miriam. I make my coffee too early on Sunday mornings. I do not wait for the phone anymore. And last Sunday, Derek called. Not because it was Sunday, just because he wanted to. We talked for 47 minutes. I did not watch the clock once.